Welcome to Stories from the Park, a Heritage Park podcast. Hi, I'm Dominic Terry, Communications Manager.
And I'm Kesia Quill, Chief Curator here at Heritage Park.
We are located on Treaty 7 land in Calgary, Alberta, a place where visitors come to learn about the history of all those who have gathered here and where Indigenous people proudly share cultural traditions and tell stories about their rich heritage, history, and attachment to the land.
In this bonus episode, we're talking about Black history in Canada, and more specifically, sleeping car porters on the Canadian Railway from the 1870s through the 1960s.
Our guest is Suzette Mayr, the Giller Prize winning author of The Sleeping Car Porter, a fictionalized account of a Black man named Baxter and his trials and tribulations as a porter.
Hi, Suzette. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited to hear more about your book.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So we were going to ask you a bit about the research for your book, and if you could tell us a little bit about sleeping cars and their place in the story of the Canadian railway history, but also where you found your research and that adventure that you went on for that.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I have to confess that at the very beginning of my research and my thinking about writing this book, I had never heard of sleeping car porters at all. I'd never heard of them. So this was about 20 years ago when a friend of mine, Fred Waugh, who's a poet, told me, because he was a former instructor of mine, former creative writing teacher, he basically gave me an assignment and he said, write a book about the sleeping car porters. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And so I started doing research into it. And part of the reason why sleeping car porters were so important for Fred was that when he was, I think in his early teens in the 1950s, he was riding a train to a scout jamboree and he had his trumpet and there was a sleeping car porter on board who took out his trombone and started jamming with Fred, started jamming with the kids. And this really struck Fred. And I think that is a great place to start when talking about this, because sleeping car porters, they were part of passenger train history from the very beginning, starting in the United States in I think the late 1800s, maybe earlier. And then coming up into Canada, that whole tradition of having Black men as basically the service workers on the trains who attended to passengers every whim, that was around for a long time. But the inherent contradiction in there is that they were, on one hand, hugely invisible. They were invisible unless they, weren't doing their job properly. They were invisible, but at the same time, they were essential to making it work. And what was really striking for me when I was doing the research was understanding how important they were in terms of, helping develop labor rights in Canada, especially for Black people, because the conditions under which they worked were just not very good. They had bad pay, they didn't get enough sleep, all kinds of things. And so they fought for better working conditions. And because they were such a driven group of people, so not just the men, but also the communities around them, the people who supported them, they also became a key part of, I would say, Canada's Black civil rights struggle as well, right? Where, people like Stanley G. Grizzle was instrumental in helping with workers' rights. Then there's also the arts, like Oscar Peterson and Daisy Peterson Sweeney, his sister. So Oscar Peterson, the jazz pianist, their father was a sleeping car porter. So what's really sad to me is that sleeping car porters aren't that well known, or they aren't as well known as they should be, even though they were pretty essential for helping develop a Black middle class, for the arts, for politics. I think there's a senator, I don't want to get his name wrong, so I probably shouldn't say it. I think his last name is Ruck, who was a sleeping car porter as well. So, I could go on and on and on.
Suzette, where did they come from? How did people? I know that they were a lot in the American railway system, but when the CPR expanded its sleeping car porter or sleeping car system in the 1870s and 80s, where did they find these people to work on them?
Yes. So from what I can understand, there were different groups of different kinds of Black communities that were sort of the origins of the sleeping car porters, or were the origin. I guess they were the sources for these sleeping car porters. So there were, say people from Nova Scotia, so Nova Scotia loyalists. So there were those men and those communities. There were, people who immigrated from Oklahoma and Texas to avoid that racism, who came up to Alberta and Saskatchewan. So that was a community. There was also a community in Vancouver. And the group I'm talking about, at least the character in my book, he is, so the CPR worked to actively recruit men from the Caribbean. And so, for example, the Bahamas, which is where my mother is from, there were Bahamian people who came from the Bahamas who worked for the railway. So it's a really interesting spread of different groups of Black people, different communities that I originally didn't know about. I thought it was primarily probably, people from Nova Scotia, maybe, the people who lived in Amber Valley, but there are also Caribbean people in there as well.
Wow, so that's a lot of different people from all over the place coming to work. So, what kind of conditions were they finding once they started working for the CPR as porters?
Part of the problem was they didn't get enough sleep. So they weren't given a berth, or they weren't given a proper bed to sleep in. And because they were on call, they weren't supposed to be on call 24/7, but they basically were, because, if a passenger, for example, in the middle of the night wanted, if a passenger was in an upper berth and wanted to get down, the porter would have to go with a ladder to help that passenger get down from their upper berth. And so that could happen throughout the night as well, right? And so in terms of the sleeping arrangements, from what I can understand, they would, be lucky if they got a bench in the smoker car. Maybe they'd get a mattress to put on there, but that was right next to the WC, so the bathroom door would be slamming back and forth. There would be all that, that air pollution from all the smoking, the cigar smoke, etc. in there. So they didn't get enough sleep. They were on call 24/7. They were asked to do all kinds of things. They could be fired for no reason. I remember looking at some archives where, one guy was disciplined because he stepped on the upholstery. One guy, I talked to a man who got fired because he accidentally spilled coffee on a passenger, but it was actually the passenger whose hands were shaking so hard from being hungover that's why the reason the coffee spilled, but that guy was fired. They also were given, depending on whichever railway company you were dealing with, they were given a deal on the food that they could buy on board. So they got maybe 50% off, whatever, for example, but the food was the bottom of the pots, and it was not good. So often they would buy from lunch counters at different stations. But, and the same thing too was that they had to rely a lot on tips in order to make up their wages. And the problem with tips, of course, is that relies on the whims of the passengers. And once you hit, the 1930s, people don't have as much money anymore. So of course their wages are going to go down. I remember reading, and I can't remember where it was, but it was, I guess, somebody who was not a porter. I think, I don't know who it was. Anyway, they discovered, they worked for the company, but they discovered that porters were able to make enough money with tips to send their kids to school. And so once that was known by the company then decided, well, we'll cut the wages because the porters can make more money in tips. And red caps, who didn't ride the trains but worked in the stations, taking care of suitcases, etc., and luggage, I think they lived primarily on tips. So it was bad pay, bad sleep, bad food, real precarity in terms of the job itself. And then of course the racism, right? Because even in Canada, the porters could end up with the nicknames of George or Boy, and George comes from the whole, because of George Pullman, who established the passenger train system, this luxury passenger train system with Black men as the servants. Yeah.
Why don't you, I guess that we should first, also say congratulations for this year's Giller Prize. It must have been, a real. I think that you said that you were very surprised when you heard that had come through for you. Tell us about first, I guess, just tell us about the process. I know that the book took a long time to write. The process of such a prestigious award. You've had several books published in the past. Tell us about the Giller Award.
Well, yeah, I was beyond shocked, honestly, because I was looking at my CV the other day for some other unrelated reason, and I realized that I published my very first poem in 1990, and my first book came out, I think, in 1995. So I've been writing for a while, and I'd kind of reconciled myself to the idea that I wasn't necessarily going to be successful in the conventional sense. I wasn't going to be a big award winner. I was just going to do my work and try to do the best I possibly could. And my novel Monoceros, which came out in 2011, was longlisted for a Giller, and that was kind of a nice tick, but or kind of a nice blip rather. But it just sort of died away. And so I was, when this book was longlisted, I thought, oh, that's great. It's going to be like Monoceros, which is I have this little blip, I'll get a couple emails, and then it will disappear and nobody will remember it. And then when it was shortlisted, it suddenly became a whole other realm of something I had never seen before, because suddenly this giant Giller machinery, media machinery came into play, and me and the other four shortlisted authors were suddenly on this cross Canada tour, reading to audiences. I have never seen audiences this big. I have never had this many book sales in my life. It was astonishing. And then when at the gala, I figured I wouldn't win because, I had a 1 out of 5 chance, but all the other authors were better known than me. And it had been a great ride. And then when they announced my name, I actually just wanted to cry, just and not because I was sad, just because out of shock and what is going on. So it has been a ride. It has been absolutely thrilling. It has been terrifying. I'm still, my book isn't even 3 months old, and I've never had this amount of attention. And I know that probably a year from now I'll be yesterday's news, and I'll be fine with that because it's a lot. Writers are introverts. We're not necessarily extroverted people. We're not necessarily made for doing a lot of publicity. So it'll be, I'm enjoying this ride while I can, and then I got to work on the next book. So, and that's the hard part, is always starting the next book. So
That's absolutely amazing, though. And I don't think you'll be yesterday's news. I think you'll be on lots of syllabuses at classes and all sorts of things. So people will probably keep reading it for years and years, and stay interested in your work. So can you tell us a little bit more about your book and just the narrative of it?
Yeah, sure. So basically the elevator pitch for the book is that it's set in the summer of 1929. It revolves around a sleeping car porter named R.T. Baxter, who is an extra. So it's not his usual line, but he's been assigned to do the Trans-Canada line from Montreal to Vancouver, which at the time was the fastest train across the continent. So this was an express line, and I've heard different numbers, but the source I have says that the trip took 88 hours and 45 minutes. Other sources say 90 plus, whatever, but it was fast. It was the fastest for the time. And on this particular trip, the train is stuck in the Rocky Mountains because there's a mudslide up ahead on the tracks, and so the train is stuck for an additional 45 hours. And so Baxter, who is already suffering from chronic sleep deprivation, starts hallucinating. And the passengers on the train start, because of their growing restlessness, it gets more and more unruly. And the other thing to know is that, not only is Baxter a Black man, which is traditional for porters of the time, which was traditional for porters at the time, but he's also a closeted gay man. And on the trip, he finds what they used to call a French postcard. So it's an erotic postcard that has an image of two naked men entwined in an amorous embrace. And so he gets stuck in the Rocky Mountains, the passengers are stuck in the Rocky Mountains, and people are getting restless and itchy, and adventures ensue. So that's basically it.
Baxter's not only working as a sleeping car porter, not only his regular job, but he's also trying to be something else, which is also a really interesting part of the story, I thought. Tell us kind of where Baxter wants to be as opposed to where he is.
That's right. So Baxter also wants to be a dentist, and he's saving up his tips. He's saving up his wages to go to dentistry school at McGill. So that's the other part of his life. And it's the one thing, or one of the things, that's saving him from the drudgery of the job. He's also I guess what we'd call nowadays maybe a sci-fi fantasy nerd. And so he's reading along the way a book called The Scarab from Jupiter, which serves as a kind of parallel to the journey he's going through on this train.
How much thought did you have to put into the dentistry angle? Because you talk about malocclusions and a whole bunch of different kind of dentistry stuff. Did you have, was there, we're kind of getting down a rabbit hole here, but won't go down it very far, but that kind of thing there, how much work did you have to put into that part of it?
I was so scared about that because I didn't want to get it wrong. At the same time, I remembered that, well, it's not as if Baxter is a dentist, so he's not going to know it perfectly. So what I ended up doing was I found through the Hathi Trust, I found some digitized dentistry textbooks from 1917, 1920, and I just read through those. And it was so fun because on one hand, there are so many elements that are the same, so the names of the teeth are the same, the anatomy has got the same naming, but the techniques are way different from now, so I remember reading in particular, and I've talked about this before in other interviews, but I find it fascinating. There was a section in one dentistry textbook where they were talking about doing dentistry on children and cavities or something like that, and literally the directions were for one adult to have the child between their knees, to hold the child while the dentist came and would, basically go with the pliers and tug the teeth out of the kid's head. So it was pretty wild. But then I also was really lucky because I was part of my process for this book was talking with Cheryl Fogo, who's a local historian, fiction writer, memoirist, who in a past life was I think she was a dental hygienist. And so I asked her to read an early version of the manuscript, and she commented on the dentistry components and had lots of great advice. That was great. And the dentistry actually started accidentally. I originally Baxter was not reading a novel called The Scarab from Jupiter. He was reading Dracula. And I was fiddling around with a scene where he was trying to figure out how the fangs worked on a vampire. And I thought, I should just take this a little bit further. And so he ends up becoming fascinated by everyone's teeth, not just vampires' teeth. And it works as a really great metaphor for, the way in which he needs to know characters, or he needs to know passengers. He needs to read passengers. He needs to be able to anticipate their every need. And so he reads them from the outside, by just looking at their clothes, the way they carry themselves, their possessions, their shoes, the state of their shoes. But he also can read them through the state of their mouths. So the conditions of their teeth, the color of their teeth. And it also is a nice distraction for him from the grossness of the job. And I have a scene in there where a passenger's yelling at him and he kind of dissociates by, just looking at the passenger's teeth as the passenger is yelling at him.
That's super interesting. And we actually, there are 2 episodes in this month that will release with Cheryl Fogo. That talks about Black history in Western Canada, and more specifically on the Prairie, and connections to here at Heritage Park. So interesting that we're all kind of intersecting in this through these podcasts. Suzette, I wonder what your comment would be on the legacy of sleeping car porters in Canadian, I guess, history, in the Black movement, Black labor movement, but also in the history of Canada's railway.
Well, I would say that, the railway was, and you know this way better than I do, but I know that the railway was one of the key. It's a major narrative in Canada's history, in the creation of this place we know as Canada, right? It was the instrument with which Canada was united as a single entity, like just because people could travel across Canada. And so you of course have the people who designed and built, or designed or had the idea of having the railway, but you also had the people who worked on the railway, like laying down the tracks, so the Chinese workers who were brought in to lay down the tracks, for example, and who gave up their lives often in many cases. And the sleeping car porters, I think, are also part of that narrative as well. They are, I guess, there were numerous Black communities that were established specifically because of the railway, because of the different major stations along the way, like Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Winnipeg, all of those places. I would say that there isn't one Canadian history, but many Canadian histories that all come together to make that Canadian history. And so the sleeping car porters are part of that Black history and the building of Black people in Canada. I'm not being very articulate about this, I guess, because it's difficult to try to emphasize just how important the little people are, I guess, in building a history. It's not just the politicians, it's not just the obvious leaders, it's not the people who appear in the official historical records, it's the communities, the smaller cultures, the subcultures. And I think the sleeping car porters, interestingly, there are many different Black communities. Black people in Canada are not one monolithic community. There are many different kinds. And the sleeping car porters, I think, kind of unified all of those communities in a way. And I'm very proud of people like Oscar Peterson, whose father got him a piano and encouraged him to play the piano, and he became a world famous pianist. I'm really proud of, Rufus Rockhead, who established Rockhead's Paradise in Montreal based on money he made smuggling booze as a sleeping car porter. I'm really proud of people like Stanley G. Grizzle. I think sometimes, I wonder if I would necessarily be here in Canada if it wasn't for sleeping car porters helping to establish Black presence and Black communities. So, yeah.
Well, we're really happy that you are here.
Me too. Me too.
Well, this has been super interesting. I'm sure, Kesia, you'd agree that it's really interesting, and I love the subculture and the different people who came together to build what we know now and in their place in the railway and that kind of thing. So, really happy that you could join us today, Suzette.
Well, I'm really happy that I have been able to join you. I worked at Heritage Park when I was younger. I was a cleaner in the exhibit, so I had a great time there. Yeah. When I was I think I was probably 18 or 19. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, good luck on your meteoric rise to fame here, and
thank you.
And have a really great Black History Month.
Yes, you too. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.